Grace, what God provides. Peace, what man experiences. The heresies were discounting the grace and upsetting the peace. So when you look at the word grace, grace is God's favor, God's gift of forgiveness, God's acceptance regardless of one's imperfections, God's promise of eternal life. These are only possible because of God's grace. So it's a compressed word. When he's talking about grace, he's talking about everything, not just grace in relations to salvation, but grace in everything. All God's grace, all God's love, everything that he offers us, he's talking about it here. So when we see that word grace there, it's really compressing everything that God gives us into this word, not just looking at it from a salvific viewpoint, right? And peace. So the peace is the felt result of God's grace is peace. You have peace of mind, peace within one's soul, peace with others, peace with oneself, all the benefits of God's grace. So through God's grace, the express result is peace, right? I was blown away when I heard that, right? But taken together, these two are the best gift God bestows on a sinful man. Paul mentions that they are indeed gifts that do not come from himself, but comes from the Father in heaven. So here, Paul doesn't give that. He say, hey, I am not giving you this grace and peace, and this comes from God. So as you now reading this letter, now you know okay, so I'm now seeing what I'm hearing from these false teachers, and this is what Paul is saying here. So, I see this being planted in their minds, I'm sure, as they go down. So, of course, these gifts, grace and peace, are in marked contrast in what these people have been experiencing with their new teachers and their new doctrines. They have been in confusion about the way to receive blessings because of the introduction of worship to angels and other intermediary spirits being beings by these teachers. So these teachers were saying, yeah, well, you have to worship angels, you have to, and you have other intermediary, other spirits, that spiritual beings that you have to worship, and they were confusing these people. They, of course, have not had peace, but rather turmoil and debate within the new doctrines they had to deal with. And the introduction of Jewish tradition, because remember, it was twofold. So they were saying, we have this new, better way than the doctrine, better than what the apostles gave you, better than what Paul would have taught Timothy, Epaphroditus, but better than what they have brought. So we now have this new way, and they would have merged because they were living in remember, this was Rome during that time, so they would have come from that era, knowing those other gods like Zeus, those other Roman, so they would have been familiar with those other Roman gods, right? And now mixing Jewish traditions inside of it also, and also the worship of angels. So it was confusing. But by introducing all of these elements now, they was trampling on the concept of grace, and we're going to show you how that was happening, right? Because when you introduce laws, tradition, the Jewish laws and tradition, and food restrictions, you're now changing it from a method of grace onto that you can earn your salvation. And we'll see what was happening here, right? So just to understand at this point, Paul's blessings, grace and peace to the Colossians was um, was something that they were not experiencing. And because of the false teachers, they were discounting grace and peace that we experience as Christians. And that was actually leading them away from the true experience and the true benefits of being a Christian to going back into being under the law, being under subjection, and away from Christ, right? So Paul was just showing them the contrast in what is supposed to be and what they were experiencing. And as you go down further into the book, he will now bring that applicable in their lives in different experiences, right? That's the beginning, right? So grace as Christians, Christians are restrained by love and not by law. So Christians are restrained by love and not by law. I don't steal, not because of a law. I don't steal because I love Christ. So I don't steal because I love my brother, or not because of law will condemn me. So let me explain it now. So why do we do what we do? Um, is it because we love Christ, or is it because we are legalistic in thinking and we don't want to break the law, right? So as Christians, we are restrained from doing, we're supposed to be restrained from doing what we are doing because of the love of what Christ did for us, rather than just trying to obey the law. So sometimes you you go right just before. You're not breaking the law, but you go right just before because you're constrained by the law because you don't want to get into trouble. But when it comes to being restrained by love, I just do it because um I love it and I love my life, right? So that was the contrast in terms of when it comes to grace versus the law. And the next thing is it is God's grace and love that not only frees us from sin, but also empowers us to overcome sin in our lives. These Colossians were being dragged back to living under the law by these false teachers. They weren't experiencing God's grace and the love that frees us from sin. They were being dragged back to live under the law. And that now turns it into a salvation by works rather than salvation by grace. I now need to earn everything. And later on, I'll show you why so much um, religions have to use this option rather than accepting grace, right? Because Christianity is the only religion that uses grace. Everything else is salvation by works, right?